If you ever find a place that already feels like it remembers you before you've even arrived, don't celebrate too quickly. Ask yourself who has been waiting. Those words didn't make any sense to me until the afternoon my roommate convinced me to drive 312 miles to his family's farm in southern Missouri. Looking back now, I realized the warning had been there from the very beginning. I just didn't know I was the one it was meant for. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 28 years old, and until that weekend, I believed I knew almost everything there was to know about Noah Carter. We'd shared a small apartment in Seattle for nearly 3 years. We split rent, argued over whose turn it was to buy groceries, watched baseball on lazy Sunday afternoons, and somehow managed to become each other's favorite person without ever talking about what that really meant. Noah was the kind of man who quietly noticed everything. If I mentioned craving blueberry pancakes once, he'd somehow make them the next Saturday morning. If I had a rough day at work, there would already be takeout waiting on the kitchen counter before I got home. He never made a big deal out of any of it. He'd just shrug and say it wasn't worth thanking him for. I thought he treated everyone that way. Maybe I wanted to believe that because it was easier than asking why someone could care that much without expecting anything back. Then one Thursday evening, while I was halfway through packing for a business trip, Noah walked into my room holding 2 mugs of coffee. He looked strangely nervous, which almost never happened. He stood there for a few seconds before speaking. "Cancel your trip next weekend," he said. I laughed because I thought he was joking. My boss might have a different opinion. "I'm serious." His voice stayed calm, but there was something underneath it I'd never heard before. "I need you to come with me to the farm." I'd heard about the farm dozens of times over the years. His grandparents still lived there. His parents had grown up there. Every fall he disappeared for a weekend to help repair fences or harvest pumpkins or fix something around the property. Somehow, despite living together for so long, he'd never actually invited me. Until now. "What's so important?" I asked. He smiled, but it looked incomplete. "I can't tell you." "Is somebody sick?" He shook his head. "Did something happen?" Another shake. "Then why are you acting like this?" He looked down at the coffee in his hands before meeting my eyes again. "Because if I tell you now, you'll spend the whole drive thinking about it instead of just being there." I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile or admit this was some elaborate prank. He never did. "Please," he said quietly, "just trust me this once." That single word lingered in the apartment long after the conversation ended. Please. Noah almost never asked anyone for anything. He was the guy everyone else leaned on. Seeing him ask me with that much sincerity made saying no feel impossible. 2 days later, my old SUV rolled onto a narrow county road lined with endless fields stretching beneath a bright Midwestern sky. My phone buzzed through the dashboard speaker. Noah's name flashed across the screen. I answered immediately. "You're close," he said. "About 5 minutes." "I think so." There was a long pause before he spoke again, softer this time. "Ethan, when you get here, don't leave. No matter how confused you feel at first. Just promise me you'll stay until you've seen everything." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "Seen what?" Another silence. Then he took a slow breath and said, "You'll understand soon enough." The line went dead before I could ask another question. I pulled off the county road a few minutes later, expecting to see an ordinary farmhouse with a weathered porch and a couple of pickup trucks parked outside. Instead, I found something that immediately made me question how much I really knew about Noah. The farmhouse was beautiful without trying to be impressive. Fresh white paint reflected the late afternoon sun. A red barn stood proudly beyond a field of wildflowers, and a long wooden fence stretched farther than I could see. Everything looked peaceful, almost like a postcard someone would send after finally finding the life they had always wanted. Before I even turned off the engine, the front door opened. Noah walked toward me with the same easy smile I had seen every morning in our apartment kitchen, but there was something different in his expression. He looked relieved, not excited, not nervous anymore. Relieved, as if he had been holding his breath for the entire drive. As soon as I stepped out of the SUV, he wrapped me in a quick hug. It lasted only a second, but it caught me off guard because Noah was never especially affectionate. He stepped back before I could react. "You actually came," he said with a quiet laugh. "You sounded like I did not have much of a choice," I answered. "Thank you for trusting me." There it was again. Trust. The same word he had used before I left Seattle. Before I could ask another question, an older woman hurried out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a flour-covered kitchen towel. "Well, there he is," she said warmly. She walked straight toward me with the confidence of someone greeting family instead of a complete stranger. She hugged me before introducing herself. "I am Margaret, Noah's grandmother." I smiled politely. "It is nice to meet you." She leaned back just enough to look at my face. "It is even nicer to finally meet you." Finally. That word stayed with me. Noah had mentioned me before, of course. That was normal. Roommates talk about each other. Still, something about the way she said it made it sound like she had been expecting me for much longer than 3 years. Before I had time to think about it, an older man wearing faded denim overalls walked down from the porch carrying a basket of fresh tomatoes. "So this is Ethan," he said with a broad smile. "You are taller than I imagined." I blinked. "Imagined?" He chuckled. "You have been part of dinner conversations around here for quite a while." Noah rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking embarrassed. "Grandpa, what?" The older man laughed. "It is true." I looked over at Noah, expecting him to explain, but he simply shrugged as though nothing unusual had been said. We carried my overnight bag inside, and I immediately noticed something else that felt strangely out of place. Family photographs covered nearly every wall in the hallway. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, harvest festivals, fishing trips. It looked exactly like every family home I had ever visited except for one detail that stopped me in the middle of the hallway. Sitting on a small shelf beneath one framed picture was a blue ceramic mug with tiny white mountains painted around the rim. I stared at it for several seconds because I recognized it instantly. I had given Noah that mug as a joke during our first Christmas living together after he accidentally broke his favorite coffee cup. He had laughed and called it the ugliest mug in America. Somehow, it had ended up here, hundreds of miles away from our apartment. I reached toward it without thinking. "Why is this here?" I asked quietly. Noah looked at the mug, then back at me, but instead of answering, he smiled in that same unreadable way he had since the trip began. "Come on," he said softly. "There is still a lot you have not seen." The rest of the afternoon passed in a way that felt strangely ordinary on the surface and completely impossible underneath. Noah showed me the vegetable garden, the chicken coop, the old fishing pond behind the barn, and the endless acres of rolling fields that had been in his family for generations. Everything should have felt like a peaceful weekend away from the city. Instead, every few minutes, something happened that left me with another unanswered question. We barely made it across the front yard before one of the neighboring farmers drove past in an aging green pickup. He slowed down, leaned out the window, and waved enthusiastically. "So you finally got him here," he shouted with a grin. Noah laughed and waved back. "Sure did." The man tipped his hat toward me as if we had met years ago. "Welcome home, Ethan." Before I could even respond, he drove away in a cloud of dust. I looked at Noah. Did he just say welcome home? Noah slipped his hands into his pockets and kept walking. "People around here are friendly." Friendly is introducing yourself. That felt different. He smiled without looking at me. "You think too much." I wanted to argue, but another distraction appeared before I could. A golden retriever came, running across the yard at full speed, tail wagging so hard that his entire body leaned from side to side. The dog stopped directly in front of me and immediately rested his head against my leg as if he had known me forever. I knelt down to pet him. "Well, at least somebody likes me." Noah chuckled. "His name is Cooper." "Has he always been this friendly?" "Not really." He watched Cooper carefully before adding. "He usually needs a while before trusting new people." I scratched behind the dog's ears while Cooper happily leaned closer. "Apparently, I am an exception," Noah quietly answered. "You have always been his exception." I looked up. "What does that mean?" He blinked as though he had almost said too much. "Nothing. Forget it." As the afternoon drifted toward evening, Margaret called us inside for dinner. The dining table was already filled with homemade biscuits, roasted vegetables, fried chicken, sweet corn, and fresh peach pie cooling on the counter. The room smelled warm and familiar in a way that instantly reminded me of childhood holidays. Conversation flowed naturally. Noah's grandfather asked about Seattle traffic. Margaret wanted to know whether I was still working in architectural design. Neither question surprised me. What surprised me was how specific they became. Margaret asked whether my favorite bakery near our apartment had reopened after remodeling. She asked if I still ordered cinnamon rolls every Saturday morning. She even laughed while reminding me not to skip breakfast before drinking coffee, because you always get a headache. I slowly lowered my fork. I had never met this woman before today. I looked across the table at Noah. He suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes. You told them all that? I asked. He gave a small shrug. Maybe. Maybe. His grandfather laughed. Son, we know more about Seattle than most people who actually live there. Everyone smiled except me. The conversation continued, but my mind stayed somewhere else. Every little detail about my life seemed to exist inside this house already. After dinner, I volunteered to help clear the dishes just to escape the growing feeling that I had stepped into someone else's memory. As I carried a stack of plates into the kitchen, my eyes landed on a corkboard hanging beside the pantry door. At first, I thought it was covered with grocery lists and family recipes. Then I noticed something tucked beneath one of the magnets. It was a faded ticket stub from a Seattle Mariners game. I recognized the date immediately because Noah and I had gone together on my birthday 2 years earlier. Underneath it was a handwritten note in neat blue ink. It read, "One of Ethan's favorite days." My heart skipped a beat because I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had never written those words, and I had never told anyone that it had been one of my favorite days. I stood in that kitchen staring at the faded ticket stub for several long seconds, trying to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe Noah had mentioned the game during a family phone call. Maybe his grandmother had written the note after hearing him tell the story. Maybe I was reading far too much into something completely innocent. That was the explanation I wanted to believe. It was also becoming the hardest one to accept. I carefully placed the ticket back where I had found it before anyone noticed I had been looking. Margaret smiled as she dried another plate. "Would you mind taking those empty jars down to the root cellar?" she asked. "Of course." She pointed toward the back hallway. "Last door on the left." I carried the small wooden crate through the hallway, passing more family photographs along the way. Halfway there, I noticed a narrow staircase leading upstairs. The second floor looked quiet. Sunlight drifted through an old window at the end of the hall, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. I had no intention of wandering around someone else's home, but curiosity has a strange way of pulling your feet before your mind has made a decision. I climbed only a few steps before hearing Noah's voice behind me. "Looking for something?" I turned so quickly that I nearly dropped the crate. He was smiling, but there was unmistakable tension in his eyes. "No, I was just exploring." He nodded slowly. "You will get to see upstairs. Tomorrow." Tomorrow. Another promise without an explanation. "Why not today?" I asked. He hesitated for just a moment. "Because it is not ready yet." "Ready for what?" His smile returned, gentle but impossible to read. "Trust me a little longer." I let out a quiet laugh. "You have said that at least 5 times today." "I know. And every time you do, I end up with even more questions." He stepped closer and took the crate from my hands. "Tomorrow, I answer every single one." There was something sincere in the way he said it that kept me from pushing any harder. Instead, we carried the jars downstairs together and spent the rest of the evening walking the property while the sky slowly turned shades of orange and purple. The farm became even more beautiful at sunset. Fireflies flickered over the tall grass. The air smelled faintly of fresh hay, and somewhere in the distance I could hear frogs calling from the pond. It felt peaceful enough that I almost forgot how unsettled I had been all day. Almost. As we reached an old wooden fence overlooking the fields, Noah stopped walking. "Do you remember our first apartment?" he asked. I laughed. "The one with the broken heater and the neighbor who practiced drums at midnight?" He grinned. "That one. How could I forget? Do you remember what you said the first night?" I frowned. "Probably something about moving out." He shook his head. "You looked out the window and said that one day you wanted a place where mornings were quiet enough to hear birds instead of traffic." I stared at him. I had completely forgotten saying that. In fact, I was not even sure I remembered saying it until he repeated the words back to me. "You remembered that?" I asked quietly. Every word. Before I could answer, Cooper suddenly came running through the field carrying something in his mouth. The dog stopped beside us and happily dropped a worn blue baseball cap onto the grass. I picked it up, brushed away a little dust, and froze. It was my old Seattle Mariners cap, the one I had spent months searching for after it mysteriously disappeared from our apartment nearly 2 years earlier. I slowly turned toward Noah, holding the cap in both hands. "How did this get here?" Noah looked at the cap in my hands, and for the first time since I had arrived, his calm expression slipped. He exhaled slowly, glanced toward the farmhouse, and then back at me. I was hoping you would not find that until tomorrow, he admitted. I turned the cap over, running my thumb across the faded logo. The tiny stain near the brim was still there from the coffee I had spilled during a Mariners game years earlier. There was no doubt it belonged to me. You told me we searched the apartment everywhere, I said quietly. We did. Then how did it end up 300 miles away? Noah opened his mouth as if he were about to answer, then stopped himself. Please, he said softly. Not yet. I laughed under my breath, but there was no humor in it. You keep asking me to wait. Because if I explain one piece now, none of the rest will make sense. I wanted to be frustrated with him. Instead, I found myself studying his face. Noah was not acting like someone hiding a lie. He looked like someone carrying a secret that had become too important to tell the wrong way. That realization somehow made me even more curious. We walked back toward the house in near silence as the last light disappeared behind the hills. After dinner, everyone settled into the living room with coffee and slices of peach pie. Margaret insisted I take the old rocking chair beside the fireplace. That one has always been your spot, she said without thinking. The room fell quiet for a heartbeat. She blinked, realizing what she had just said. I mean, if you had visited before, I think it would have been. She smiled warmly, trying to recover, but I noticed Noah gently squeeze her shoulder before changing the subject. The conversation drifted toward family stories and memories from the farm. I listened more than I spoke. Every now and then someone would mention something that sounded oddly familiar, as if they had built an image of me long before we ever met. Later that evening, unable to sleep, I stepped onto the back porch. The air was cool, and thousands of stars stretched across the sky, brighter than anything I had ever seen in Seattle. I heard the screen door creak behind me. Noah joined me, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate instead of coffee. You always sleep better after hot chocolate, he said, handing me one. I smiled despite myself. You really do remember everything. Some things are worth remembering. We stood side by side without speaking. The silence felt comfortable, the way it always had between us. Then Noah glanced toward the old barn sitting quietly beneath the moonlight. Tomorrow morning, he said, there is somewhere I want to take you before breakfast. I followed his gaze. The barn looked ordinary except for a small second-story window glowing with a faint yellow light. Is somebody in there? I asked. Noah smiled. Not tonight. Then why is there a light on? He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Because I forgot to turn it off earlier. His answer sounded reasonable, but something inside me said it was not the whole truth. After Noah went back inside, I remained on the porch for another minute, staring at that tiny window. Curiosity finally won. I quietly crossed the yard, careful not to wake Cooper sleeping near the porch steps. The barn door was unlocked. I slipped inside, the scent of old wood and fresh-cut pine filling the air. Moonlight filtered through narrow cracks in the walls as I climbed the creaking staircase toward the faint glow above. When I reached the second floor, I stopped in the doorway. In front of me stood shelves lined with neatly labeled boxes, framed photographs, rolled-up blueprints, and dozens of carefully organized keepsakes. Every label carried the same single word written in blue marker. Ethan. I stood frozen in the doorway, convinced for a moment that I had misunderstood what I was seeing. Maybe Ethan was a family name. Maybe there was another Ethan somewhere in Noah's life that he had never mentioned. But as I stepped closer, every excuse I tried to invent quietly disappeared. The nearest shelf held a row of carefully labeled storage boxes. The first one read, Ethan College Years. The next one said, Ethan Favorites. Another simply read, Ideas. My heartbeat became louder than the crickets outside. I slowly opened the first box. Inside were ticket stubs, coffee shop receipts, postcards, and dozens of tiny reminders from ordinary days that most people would have forgotten. There was the receipt from the first diner where Noah and I had breakfast after moving into our apartment. There was a movie ticket from a rainy Friday night when the power had gone out across our neighborhood. There was even a folded paper napkin with a terrible sketch I had drawn while waiting for our food to arrive. I remembered laughing because I could not draw to save my life. Somehow Noah had kept it. I carefully set everything back exactly where I had found it before reaching for another box. This one contained photographs. None of them had been taken secretly. Most were perfectly normal pictures from birthdays, hiking trips, holiday dinners with mutual friends, or baseball games. The strange part was not the photographs themselves. It was that I had no idea Noah had saved every single one. Behind the stack rested a small notebook bound in dark blue leather. I hesitated before opening it. The first page contained nothing except a date from nearly 3 years earlier and one sentence written in Noah's familiar handwriting. Today, Ethan laughed so hard that everyone else in the restaurant started laughing too, and I realized I would spend my whole life protecting that sound if I could. I stopped breathing for a moment. I turned another page. He thinks nobody notices when he pretends he is fine after a difficult day. I notice. Another page. He still believes he talks too much when he is nervous. I wish he knew those are my favorite conversations. There were no dramatic declarations. No grand speeches. Just hundreds of quiet observations about moments I barely remembered living. Every page revealed another ordinary memory that had somehow become extraordinary through Noah's eyes. I closed the notebook carefully, suddenly feeling as though I had walked into the most private room inside another person's heart. I was hoping you would wait until tomorrow. Noah's voice came softly from behind me. I turned so quickly that the notebook almost slipped from my hands. He stood in the doorway with his hands resting in his jacket pockets. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed, but not with me. More with himself. "You followed me?" I asked. He shook his head. I woke up and saw the porch was empty. "I figured you might come here." I looked around the room again. "All of this, how long?" He smiled sadly. "Longer than you probably want to hear tonight." I held up the notebook. "Why did you keep all this?" He took a slow breath before answering. "Because memories disappear faster than people think. I did not want to lose the small ones." My eyes drifted past him toward the far wall. Leaning against it was a large wooden frame covered by a canvas cloth. It was nearly 7 feet wide, much larger than anything else in the room. I pointed toward it. "What is that?" Noah followed my gaze. His expression softened in a way I had never seen before. After several quiet seconds, he whispered, "That is the reason I asked you to come here in the first place." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The quiet inside the barn no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt heavy, as though every unanswered question I had carried since arriving had gathered in that single room. Noah slowly walked past me toward the large canvas-covered frame resting against the far wall. He placed one hand on the edge of the cloth, but did not pull it away. "I wanted you to see everything else first," he said quietly. "Otherwise, this would not have meant what it is supposed to mean." I looked around once more at the shelves filled with memories. I do not think anything could have prepared me for this. He smiled gently. "Maybe not." He took a slow breath before continuing. "Do you remember that night about 2 years ago when the power went out during the storm?" I nodded. "We sat in the apartment with flashlights because neither of us could sleep. You started sketching on the back of an old grocery receipt. At first I barely remembered it. Then the memory slowly returned. We had joked about escaping city life one day. Just to pass the time, I had drawn a tiny cabin with a front porch, large windows, and a workshop nearby. It was nothing more than a rough doodle from a sleepless night." I laughed softly. "That drawing was terrible." Noah laughed too. "Your drawing was terrible. Your idea was not." Before I could ask what he meant, he carefully lifted the canvas away. I felt my breath catch. Mounted inside the enormous wooden frame was not a painting. It was a complete architectural blueprint, professionally drafted on large sheets of paper protected beneath glass. Every room, every hallway, every window had been carefully measured. I stepped closer without realizing it. The layout looked strangely familiar. Then I noticed a handwritten note preserved in one corner. My own handwriting. It was copied from that old grocery receipt. A place where mornings are quiet enough to hear birds instead of traffic. I stared at the words, unable to speak. Noah stood beside me, giving me all the time I needed. "You kept my sketch?" I finally whispered. "I kept the idea," he answered. "The original drawing fell apart after a while, so I redrew it." My eyes followed every line across the blueprint. The wraparound porch, the oversized kitchen, the reading nook beside the front window, even the woodworking shop behind the house. Every small detail we had casually imagined during that blackout had somehow become part of a real design. "You built all of this?" I asked. Noah shook his head. "Not yet." He pointed toward the window overlooking the property. "Come outside." We climbed down from the loft and walked through the cool night air without saying another word. Instead of heading back toward the farmhouse, Noah led me across the field behind the barn. The moonlight stretched across the grass, and the only sounds were insects singing in the distance and our footsteps moving through the quiet. After several minutes, we reached the top of a gentle hill. Noah stopped and pointed toward an open clearing surrounded by oak trees. At first I saw nothing except freshly turned earth and wooden stakes connected by bright orange construction string. Then I noticed concrete footings already set into the ground. The shape looked familiar because I had been staring at it only moments earlier inside the barn. It matched the blueprint almost perfectly. I slowly turned toward Noah. He smiled, with tears beginning to gather in his eyes, though his voice remained steady. That is where the house is going to stand. I looked back at the empty foundation, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then he quietly added the sentence that changed everything. I never designed it for myself. I designed it for the life I hoped we might someday choose together. For a long time, I could not find a single word to say. The breeze moved gently through the tall grass, carrying the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers, but everything else seemed to disappear. My eyes stayed fixed on the unfinished foundation stretching across the hill. It was not just a construction site. It was a promise that had existed long before I even knew it had been made. Noah never looked away from me. He did not rush to explain himself. He did not ask for an answer. He simply waited, the same patient way he had waited through every ordinary day we had shared in Seattle. Finally, I broke the silence. How long? My voice barely rose above a whisper. Noah smiled sadly. I think the better question is when. I turned toward him. Then when? He looked out across the property before answering. The night you drew that little cabin on the grocery receipt, I realized something I had been trying to ignore for months. He laughed softly at himself. I kept telling myself that what I felt would eventually disappear if I stayed quiet. Instead, every ordinary day made it stronger. He bent down and picked up a small stone from the ground, turning it slowly in his fingers. I did not fall in love during some dramatic moment. It happened while making coffee before work, while listening to you complain about Seattle traffic, while watching terrible movies that neither of us actually liked. It happened in all the moments people usually forget. I felt my chest tighten because I remembered every one of those moments. I had simply never seen them the way he had. Noah continued, his voice calm and steady. I never wanted to pressure you. I never wanted our friendship to become something you felt responsible for. So I made a decision. I would keep loving you quietly for as long as that was enough. He smiled again, though emotion filled his eyes. Then one day you looked out our apartment window and talked about wanting a peaceful place where life could slow down. I came home after that weekend and started drawing. I looked back toward the foundation. You actually planned all of this, piece by piece. He nodded. Every time I visited the farm, I worked on it a little more. The blueprints, the permits, saving money, talking with my grandparents. They knew why I was doing it long before anyone else did. Suddenly Margaret's words from dinner echoed in my mind. It is even nicer to finally meet you. Welcome home, Ethan. You have always been his exception. None of those comments had been accidents. They had all been pieces of the same story. That is why everyone already knew me, I said quietly. Noah gave a small nod. They knew about the person who made me smile every time I talked about him. They knew about the man who inspired a house before he ever saw the land. I laughed softly through the emotion building inside me. I spent this whole weekend thinking I had stumbled into someone else's memories. Noah looked at me with the gentlest expression I had ever seen on his face. You did. He paused before adding. The difference is that every one of those memories belonged to you, too. You just never knew someone else had been protecting them. I looked once more at the unfinished foundation, then back at Noah. For the first time since arriving at the farm, all of the strange details stopped feeling confusing. They fit together perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for one final corner. But there was still one question I needed answered. I met Noah's eyes and quietly asked, if you had already built a future around a dream we never talked about, why tell me now instead of keeping it a secret forever?